We left last week with the death of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And with the death of the Ayatollah, there was actually no clear replacement. The once designated successor, Hussein Ali Montazeri, fell out with the Ayatollah and that left a vacancy. And so in Iran, there's what's called the Assembly of Experts. They're kind of like that recruiting committee from The Office, except they were tasked with the biggest job of the country, appointing the new supreme leader of Iran. And in 1989, they made their call and appointed the man who had heroically served as Khomeini's president throughout the Iran-Iraq War. Iran's new Ayatollah was 50-year-old Ali Khamenei.
Hello there.
Okay, so when it comes to Iran under the supreme leadership of Ayatollah Khamenei, I'm going to cover 3 decades of both foreign and domestic policy, and so it goes without saying that I'll have to leave out some pretty important stuff. I guess my aim for this video is to teach you what I think are the most important things to know about Iran's recent history in 9 minutes. And to do that, we're going to look at Iran under the leadership of its 4 presidents who served under Ali Khamenei. Now, it's important to break down the difference between the supreme leader and the president. Unquestionably, the supreme leader is more powerful because they're the head of state and the commander-in-chief. However, their main source of power comes from the fact that the Assembly of Experts, President and Parliament all have to be vetted by the Guardian Council. And who chooses the Guardian Council? Well, Ali Khamenei. But the president is still very important. They represent the democratic component of the Islamic Republic, and once elected by the people, they can actually implement policies in much more specific detail than the supreme leader, whose hands are really spread across every arm of Iranian government. Of course, the president does need the approval of the supreme leader's Guardian Council. And so Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani was the first president to serve under Ali Khamenei. And Iran under Rafsanjani was pretty predictable in that they remained pretty hostile to the USA. If you missed last week, Ruhollah Khomeini was able to win popular support in Iran due to the Shah being seen as a puppet of America, and Iran's hostility to America was solidified with their support of Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War. Basically, Iran supported Hezbollah, a fundamentalist Shiite party in Lebanon who engaged in back and forth attacks against Israel throughout the 1990s, but that's for another day. When Khomeini came to power, he was very quick to withdraw the Shah's support for Israel as a nation and called it occupied Palestine. And so it's with this context then that when Rafsanjani became the president in the 1990s, he looked to nuclearize Iran. Israel was the only state in the Middle East that had nukes, and now with Iran and Israel butting heads, Iran felt a more pressing need to do the same. And so, because of their support for Hezbollah and their path towards nuclearization, Clinton accused them of harboring terrorists. Domestically, Rafsanjani's administration increased the scope of public services as their education program saw literacy increase from 58% to 75% throughout the 1990s. However, wages barely grew throughout the decade, and by 1997, Iran opted for a more liberal candidate, Mohammad Khatami. Basically, Khatami campaigned on increased freedom of expression and a society that was less extreme with its punishments. He also sought to increase wages by improving relations with the surrounding states. Amongst Khatami's key diplomatic visits were Vladimir Putin, Hugo Chavez, and Pope John Paul II.
You make the Pope look like a fool. God will make you pay. Smite them!
Under Khatami, Iran negotiated a trade cooperation agreement with the European Union, and he even sat next to Israeli President Moshe Katsav at the funeral of the Pope. Now, this was purely alphabetical, but this in conjunction with Khatami's cooperation with the outside world led to the accusation that he was now legitimizing Israel. And despite the good GDP growth that came under the Khatami administration, there was still quite high unemployment. Khamenei's more conservative and zealously Shiite members of parliament also often voted against Khatami. By the turn of the century, liberal newspapers were starting to endure press bans, with the press court suspending or closing at least 8 publications during 2002 on charges including publishing propaganda or lies. Khatami was ousted in 2005, and he was replaced with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And I like Norman Lowe's description of Ahmadinejad as being the common man of Iran.
With regards to common man discussion,
Ahmadinejad had previously served as the mayor of Iran's capital, Tehran, and he was also fiercely nationalist, yet also opposed the strictness of the Ayatollahs, as many of the younger Iranians were starting to do, though he still kissed Khamenei's hand during his inauguration to indicate that he respected the supreme authority of the leader. Ahmadinejad's big campaign promise was to put Iran's oil wealth on the dinner table or picnic rug of every Iranian, yet by 2009, that never really materialized. Ironically, the best the poor Iranians could get was excess potato stocks, which a crowd gathered and sarcastically chanted, "Death to potatoes." And if you think Trump's election fraud claim was a debacle, Iran's 2009 contested presidential election was insane. Officially, Ahmadinejad won the election with 63% of the vote, but this was widely disbelieved by millions who thought Ahmadinejad was going to lose. Having accused the government of fraud, many Iranians gathered in protest, and this was called the Green Movement. However, Khamenei applauded the result
I love democracy.
and said that there would be repercussions if the streets weren't cleared.
Now you will experience the full power of the dark side.
And Khamenei wasn't bluffing. He fired on the crowds and entered Tehran University. It's unknown how many were killed, but it's safe to say that it was probably around just over 100. As Iran continued with its nuclearization, the US and the EU put sanctions back on them, though Russia and China came out in support of them. And as Iran progressed through the early 2010s, the Green Movement became bigger. They voiced their support for the Arab Spring and even defied the government to stage a demonstration in support of it. By 2013, our fourth and final Iranian president for today came to power, Hassan Rouhani, and by 2015, Iran had made a deal with the USA. The famous Iran nuclear deal reduced its uranium enrichment levels to 3.7% of what it was, far from what was needed to make good nuclear weapons. In return, the US and the EU lifted oil and trade sanctions. And prior to the EU sanctions, European car manufacturers like Peugeot and Volkswagen had profited from Iranian oil and welcomed the easing of oil sanctions. US companies based outside of the USA could also trade just about freely with Iran as well. However, fast forward to 2018 and America had since changed administrations. Trump ripped up the
At
deal,
the point
claiming
when
that
the
it failed to
United
curtail Iran's
States
missile program
had
and regional
maximum
influence.
leverage, this disastrous deal gave this regime, and it's a regime of great terror, many billions of dollars, some of it in actual cash. A great embarrassment to me as a citizen.
And then in 2019, Iran simply stopped caring about its uranium enrichment levels, to which Trump approved more sanctions. Then in June 2019, things really heated up. Iran shot down a US drone flying in its airspace. Trump then approved military airstrikes, which would have created a really tense situation, but he pulled out and didn't go through with them in the end.
I may be wrong, and I may be right, but I'm right a lot. I have a feeling that it was a mistake made by somebody that shouldn't have been doing what they did.
Then in January 2020, Major General Qasem Soleimani was assassinated in Baghdad airport when America dropped airstrikes. Iran threatened retaliation, and Trump, in return, threatened to bomb 52, quote, very high level and important sites, one for each American hostage taken in the 1979 to 1981 Iran hostage crisis. This didn't happen and the world got distracted, but now with Biden in and a new Iranian president, a return to the Iran nuclear deal could be back on. We'll just have to wait and see. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to let me know by hitting the like button, and do make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Leave a comment below with who you'd like to see for next week's episode of Enemies of the West, and we can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.